And let's begin with prayer. Save your people, Lord, and bless those who are yours. Be their shepherd and take care of them forever. Amen. Okay, I know when we do 2 lessons, there's lots and lots to do, but I hope you see the intent of doing that. If not, thanks for putting up with it. As always, we'd like to invite where you are this week, either with the Messiah readings or the prayer readings. And if we want to go backward at all into Exodus, that is, of course, more than fine. So let me just invite our checking in. What touched you, or are you curious to know more about, or I don't know what to do with that information?
I'll jump in. On page 140, it says, where do you see evidence of the revolution in the world today? I'm not sure I see evidence of a revolution.
Of an economic revolution like the Magnificat mentions.
Yeah. I don't see it.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to put these in the chat. So by the way, always feel free to engage now, or if you've got something else on your mind, and then we'll circle back to the chat if that seems good. Lila asked a question earlier. She asked, when we talk about Jesus praying, did he pray the Psalms? What would Jesus have prayed? That's a really great question. And it's hard to know, Lila, what exactly the answer is, because of course the Psalms were not a prayer book, they were a hymnal. So it's interesting that the church has turned the Psalter into a prayer book, but it was similar to the hymnal that we have. Most of the musical settings have been lost to us from the Psalter. Did people pray through the Psalms at the time of Jesus? Hard to know the answer to that. In fact, there's a lot of conversation about what happened in synagogues and when synagogues as they now happen, sort of now as they are, when those showed up. Certainly there was Torah study happening in synagogues, but whether or not they were a place of corporate prayer, and whether or not they used the Jewish prayer books called the Siddur, whether or not they used something like a Siddur, I'm not sure how really to date that. There was a big discovery of a synagogue in Migdal. We went there in 2017 on the pilgrimage to Israel. This is where Mary Magdalene is purportedly from. And there is there's a stone that's carved that seems to be where the Torah might have been read, but we're still unpacking when all of that happened. What did Jesus pray? Boy, that's a great question. I don't really know. Some of the prayers that he offers are you unclean spirit, come out of her or him. And that sounds like a imperative. It is, but that's a prayer, right? Was the other stuff what we call prayers of petition or thanksgiving or celebration or just meditation or contemplation? And we don't know. So Lila, that's my not very helpful answer. I don't know enough about all that. Lila also asked this question. The Pope, recently offered a translation of the Lord's Prayer from "Lead us not into temptation" to do not let us fall into temptation. I don't know, and specifically, like, are we going to adopt that phrase? I don't know the answer to that, whether that's going to be changed in the new prayer book. It's this curious thing when we start changing traditional language. It's really like bothersome to folks, even if like there's good reasons. People are real resistant to that. If you don't know about that, let me tell you, that's a thing. That's a real thing. You know, the sense of it, like, lead us not into temptation. It's hard to know whether that believes that that God leads us into temptation or not. I'm not super comfortable with that idea, even though in the Hebrew Bible, everything comes from God, good or bad, right? Because there's really a strong monotheism, not like an evil force opposed to God working in the world. But I hear that phrase a little bit differently. I mean, to be honest, a lot of, there's that phrase that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I sometimes think people believe they're following God when really they're just doing what they want to do, blaming God for their terrible decisions. So I don't know, honestly, when I hear that phrase or when I pray that phrase, lead us not into temptation, I sort of think like, well, God, I hope I don't enter into temptation in your name. But maybe that's just me doing some verbal gymnastics. One other thing that Lila suggested was that she really enjoyed the Magnificat. When we just read the precursor for that on Sunday, it's the Song of Hannah. And she loves the idea that maybe Mary simply was the first woman who said yes. Like, God had asked a bunch of women, will you do this? And they all said no. And Mary just happened to be the first one, was like, oh, I guess so. And so, like, saying yes to God is like part of the thing, which is, it's interesting, right? Like, to me, that's a cool takeaway. There was a time in my life where, like, I had to change what friends meant. Friends were not like necessarily like soulmates, but they were just people who said yes. That was helpful for me. And sometimes, like, maybe we don't have to be the best whatever, but we just say yes, right? Like, to me, that's a cool, livable thing. Lila also mentioned that Hannah gave her child to God. And I do want to return to that, because I didn't preach about it on Sunday, but it's like a weird thing. Hannah really wants to have a baby so she can have cultural value. And as soon as she has it, she's like, I'm not raising that baby. I mean, maybe that's a cynical read, right? But she drops it off at the fire station, also known as the temple, and leaves the kid. It's like a strange model in mothering. Mary, on the other hand, chooses to raise the child Jesus. I don't know what to make of that, and that's off the wall and maybe not helpful for you. Okay, but thanks for those questions, Lila. I don't know that I did any of them justice, but I'm grateful for you offering those through email.
Hi, Mike.
Hey there.
Thank you for taking those through email. So I also wanted to say that to build community, saying yes to one another when we possibly can is so important. It's so important. And I try to do that with my church family, but I especially do try to say yes when you ask something, Mike, because you truly bear the burden of leadership in our community, and it is a burden. And I appreciate that.
Well, I do want to say that, the yoke is supposed to be easy and the burden is supposed to be light, to quote the good book. And often that's the case. I do want to be mindful, though, that sometimes I've got these cockamamie ideas, and sometimes it's best to say no to those. Like, hey, that's a terrible idea. Let's be doing that thing. Or, wow, that would not be life-giving for me. Probably not for anybody else. So hard no on that. And so, like that's all this needs to be in the cloud. For me, anyway, that needs to be in my cloud. Sometimes people say, hey, Mike, I've got this really great idea for you to do. And increasingly, I say, like, I'm not going to do that, but I'm happy to bless your idea when you do it. Knowing when to say that is important, right? Like, because they're saying yes to God, and there's also saying like yes to my family and like personal boundaries, and like, and that's for all of us, you know.
Hey, Mike,
Yes, sir.
in the readings for the day, when John the Baptist was born, he was not supposed to have any wine.
Yes.
And then Jesus comes along and celebrates the Last Supper with wine.
Mhm.
I don't quite understand that.
So that's really easy. There's a thing in the Hebrew Bible called Nazarites. So a Nazarite is somebody, Nazarite means guardian in Hebrew. And a Nazarite is essentially somebody who takes a short vow. It's usually short, like limited, like think about Lent. And during the time of that vow, they're going to not do three things. They're not going to drink any wine. They're not going to cut their hair, and they're not going to touch anything dead. And that includes eating meat, right? Because meat is death. The Apostle Paul clearly makes a Nazarite vow at a certain point. When the vow's over, you shave your head to show that it's over, and you sort of start anew. It's sort of like being reborn after your vow is complete. There's some people who want to kill Paul, and they make a vow that they're not going to eat anything until he's dead. So this is like a Nazarite kind of vow. Now, there's only 3 people in the Bible who are meant to be Nazarites their whole life. One of them is Samuel. And Hannah says he's going to be a Nazarite his whole life. So you would presume Samuel was a vegetarian. He never drank alcohol, and he didn't cut his hair. There's Samson, who's born a Nazarite. Now, both of these were difficult births, remember, really hard. Parent of old age, infertile person. Samson breaks every one of his Nazarite vows. He gets drunk. Delilah cuts his hair. He kills a lion and pulls honey out of it. That's a dead thing. But then there's John, right? And John lives a Nazarite vow his whole life. Did the Spirit tell them to do that? Did they just decide? Anyway, that's what John does. Jesus is not a Nazarite. And he curiously goes on to say, John came neither eating or drinking, and you said he's got a demon. He must be crazy to live such an extreme life. But I came eating and drinking, and you said I'm a glutton and a drunkard. There's no way of making you people happy. I mean, I think that's what he's saying, right? Like, you can find fault with anybody if that's what you choose to do. I do want you to know that the Gospel of Matthew, which we're not reading right now, does this kind of weird thing around Nazarite language. Matthew says, you know, Jesus went to Nazareth to fulfill this prophecy. He'll be called the Nazarene. Well, the prophecy says he'll be called a Nazarite. So what Matthew does is says, hey, Nazarite sounds like Nazareth, so that works. But I just want you to be clear, it doesn't work. It just is close. And Matthew's not trying to do this prophetic, like Nostradamus predicted and it happened. What he's trying to say is, look at the resonance between Jesus and the Hebrew Bible. He went to the village of Nazareth, like where guardians are from. It's not where they're from. So it's symbolic, that bit. Wine and bad. If you're Jewish, like you can't have a wedding without wine. And people drank wine all the time, safer than water, and he had nutritional properties to it, right? Cutting your hair isn't bad. In fact, if you're Jewish, there's 5 places on your face you're not supposed to shave. Touching a dead body is fine as long as you purify yourself after it. So there's nothing like inherently wrong with these. They're just a way of like setting apart this period of time in your life. So you can have a vision quest, or so you can be reminded like, hey, I'm doing this special vow for God. But that's supposed to be temporary, minus these 3 people. Tim, I hope that answered your question. Yeah, you're on. There you go.
Okay, what I don't understand is John didn't make the vow. It was,
His parents did.
oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and the same week you could say for Samuel and for Samson. The folks made that choice on their behalf. And that's probably because, you know, all three of those kids were really set apart. They were like, these were children to infertile people. Like, these were impossible pregnancies. And so they're saying, like, this is so impossible that we're going to like show that with this person's entire life. John, can I ask what stood out for you this week?
Well, I read not all, but some of it early last week. And then I spent the last 4 days until yesterday afternoon in Port Mansfield, Texas, looking at birds. So I'm not on board so much with this. I did just look up what a Nazarite is, and I like the idea that a person can pick the length of their commitment as opposed to somebody else picking it for them.
Yeah.
So I wish I could offer more. I just can't this time.
You've slept since.
I had a good time down there.
Glad to hear it. Jane?
This week was kind of wonky for me. And we had some ups and downs, and I haven't gotten through this yet. Last night I had a literal down, but you know.
And you're okay after that, right?
Yeah, a little sore.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's my fault.
Well, I have a tripping hazard in my home, and Jane found it. And anyway. Darlene, may I ask if there's anything that stood out for you?
Okay. I think I got it.
You got it.
I'm acutely aware of the uncleanliness of women, the attitude of uncleanliness of women in this ancient culture. However, something that was new for me in this is that women were twice as unclean if they gave birth to a girl child than if they gave birth to a male child. They had to be isolated and twice as long as with the male child. And so that was something that was just a new tidbit of information that is hard for me.
Thank you. It's hard.
Yeah.
Miss Ellen, how about you?
Oops, still not unmuted.
You are. No, you're good.
One of the things that I got from the readings was how closely Jesus was raised in the Hebrew tradition. And so many, I mean, I kind of knew that overall, but it pointed out different things that I wasn't aware of and how that would have been really important in that culture. So he had that real grounding in the religious tradition of his time, and then was able to bring it to new, larger life in his teachings. And so I was kind of thinking about that all week, and trying to choose the better life in making decisions because of the changes that I've been making in my own life. So that was kind of what stood out to me. And I had some notes, but I forgot to bring my book. So that's all I have.
Okay. Appreciate it very much. Okay.
I have a lot of notes too, but something that I hadn't really thought about was when they went to, I have a question too about it. When they went to dedicate Jesus at the temple, they called it a sacrifice, where they sacrificed him, and then they were able to redeem him, get him back, and that was to remind them of the firstborn being spared and passed over in Egypt. And was that like a baptism, or that they were, what was the sacrifice? Or, and then the other thing I found interesting that I never read into it before was that their sacrifice was 2 turtle doves. And it reminded me of the song.
And a partridge in a pear tree.
Yeah. So, but I wasn't quite sure about that ritual that was required of them, where they sacrifice him.
Thank you. So this is one of these things that we don't do anymore. It's this idea that we, with the firstborn, and we saw it show up in Exodus, belongs to God. And that in ancient traditions, like especially regarding like Chemosh and Molech, the demand was that you literally killed your firstborn child as a sacrifice to the deity. And God didn't want you to kill the kid, but God did want you to redeem the kid by making a like a sort of a representative sacrifice in the place. I know that's weird and we don't do it, and I'm glad for that, right? Like when my daughter was born, we didn't do that. So this is what's going on, and you know, the sacrifice normally would be a lamb, but if you're too poor for a lamb, you use turtle doves. And so this is a testimony, right, that Jesus's family could not afford a lamb. Again, we don't do this anymore. We don't redeem our firstborn by killing any kind of animal, and Jewish people don't do that either. Ever since the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, this is all kind of moot, right? Without the temple, you don't have a place where you can offer sacrifice. That's kind of the understanding. So I don't know if that explained it very well, but that's kind of what's going on and why you see the turtle doves. Supposedly, by the way, that song, 12 Days of Christmas, each thing is a symbol for something else, and it's kind of like a catechism that walks you through if you know all the symbology. Like 3 French hens represents the Trinity or something like that. I don't know if I buy all that, but I've been told that. Anyway. Again, the fundamental idea is we owe God the life of our firstborn child, so we can either drop the baby off at the temple like Hannah did, or we can have a substitute and pour the life out to God. But the instructions are, do not kill your firstborn. Do not do that. Maybe it's helpful just to add in really briefly this, I don't know if it's helpful, but Ellen, I appreciate you mentioning the Jewish context for Jesus, because we watched this series by Amy Jill Levine, who's a New Testament scholar and a rabbi, last year. And she said, you know, we have this tendency when we read the Gospels to read them anti-Semitically. Like, look at these Jewish people and all their purity concerns. Aren't we glad we don't live like that anymore? And Amy Jo Levine's like, yeah, except Jesus was Jewish, and so were the people like who wrote the Bible. So to read it anti-Semitically like that would be a really big mistake. And it ties this differentiation between Judaism and Christianity that's like artificial and not helpful. And beyond that, like we've got our own purity problems. Let's just be honest about that. We usually aren't honest about it, but we've got our own problems with that stuff. I can give you some examples if you want in a second, but it may be as helpful to hear that when you read Jesus's teaching, the only thing that's like new are the parables. That's the only new information. It's the only thing like original to Jesus. And then the disciples have this experience after he dies where he's more alive to them after he dies than when he was alive. We call that the resurrection, right? But, you know, to go and say like, oh, well, so that voids everything. Again, I bristle when people talk about the Old Testament because it's the Hebrew Bible and it's our scriptures. And there's this one way of reading the Hebrew Bible that says like, hey, God was real mean back then and God dealt with the law and then God decided to be nice. And must be terrible to be one of those Jewish people who don't know about that. That just seems real tough. I mean, that just seems so anti-Semitic. And beyond that, like, I have a hard time imagining God changing the deal. Seems like maybe hopefully we re-understand the deal in ways that are life-giving. But sometimes the way that we look at the Hebrew Bible is not the way our Jewish brothers and sisters look at it. We use words like commandments and law and legalism. Jewish people don't understand their faith that way at all. They understand commitments and guidance. So a lot of times we caricature Judaism then and now to our detriment. And you got to remember, Jesus like went to the temple and worshiped there, even though he was sometimes critical of the place. I could criticize our church. I'm glad to go here. This is good to remember, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mike,
Jane,
this
please.
is maybe totally off topic, but how does what the book interprets or the workbook information match up to what you wrote in Living on the Plain, the perspectives?
You know, Jane, I'm such an Enneagram type 4 that my temptation is to say I don't even care. But you know, some of it matches that pretty well. I mean, honestly, like to think about the temptations and what they mean. It talks about like messianic expectations of the day. That seems really helpful. You know, I'm not like put off with much in the workbook. I have a different perspective on like prayer, which I shared a little bit last week. But to me, it's about, you know, this allows us to have a little more like robust conversation. And the you know, for me, part of the point of Living on the Plain was to say like, well, I've studied and written about this and tried to live into this for a while. So like, what if I took a snapshot about like some of the insights I've gleaned? I told Darlene last week on Sunday, I mean, I would, if I read the thing, I'd like to change everything I wrote because like things stand out to me since 2 years ago when I wrote the thing, you know, but I had to kind of quit or I'd never have anything, you know. I mean, that's sort of the deal. I don't know if that was really helpful. Probably not.
It was. Thank you.
Some of the things I noticed in the book, Jane, though, that seem really important are that frame about kingdom and family system. You know, when you read the genealogy, which we read, it doesn't just go back to Abraham, it goes back to Adam. And then it says Adam is a child of God. And unlike Matthew, which quits at Abraham, I just feel like Luke is really pushing us to think that we're all children of God. Mm-hmm. And we're invited to live into this family group, and that Jesus is actually like, that's one way Luke frames his whole ministry. Some people don't like the way women get treated in Luke, but I'll tell you, it's the most like women-centric gospel that there is. And you notice that there's this guy Simeon, but then there's also Anna.
Mhm.
Luke is the only one that has the women. Matthew is all about Joseph. And Luke is about Mary and Elizabeth. They don't have any lines in Matthew. No lines. It's all Joseph. Luke is the one that says the women are the ones who paid for Jesus to have a ministry. Luke is the one that has the women be the first witnesses to the resurrection, right? So like they show up.
Mhm.
And I think they show up in such a way, like with Darlene. I mean, I choose to believe Luke is trying to emphasize their personhood. And instead of saying women are doubly unclean, like look at all the stuff that they do. Tim asked this great question about the genealogy. You know, we always say like Jesus is in the line of which famous king? David, right? Like he's been the line of David. He's not related to David at all. Joseph was related to David, but guess what? Joseph's not his dad. You might be thinking, isn't Judaism matrilineal? Not since like 1100 of the Common Era. Judaism comes through your mother only for about 1,000 years. Very patriarchal. So when we hear that genealogy, it's symbolic. It's symbolic. Luke does a weird thing. When you read Matthew's gospel in the genealogy, it's David and then Solomon and then etc. When you read Luke's, it's David and David's son Nathan. Well, David didn't have a son named Nathan, unless Nathan was Solomon's nickname. Nathan was that prophet that came up to David and said, you killed that woman and it was wrong. So it makes me wonder if Luke isn't saying in conversation with Matthew, okay, there's David, and then there's a guy who called David out. And Jesus comes from those things, both of those things. I don't know. Tim asked me, did any of the gospel writers actually know Jesus? Well, Matthew is the only one who could possibly have been a disciple other than John. John was written so late that no scholar would tell you the John that wrote the gospel was the John who knew Jesus, because John didn't show up till about 70 years after the crucifixion. Now, it's possible he lived 85 years, but it'd be a stretch. That was abnormal life expectancy. Luke didn't know Jesus, no doubt about that. Mark might have been that guy in the garden who runs away naked. I don't know if you know that incident, but he wasn't a disciple. Most people think Matthew wasn't the Matthew. It might have been like people who gathered around Matthew and wrote down what Matthew told them. John asked me, what historical proof do we have that Jesus existed? There's some external verifications from like Josephus and Trajan. I mean, actually very few historians debate whether this was a guy. It's pretty accepted the guy was real. That's different from King David. A lot of discussion about whether that was a real person or not. Could have been an amalgamation of stories to be like the golden legend of like Israel's high day. But there are a couple of external folk, John, who have penned lines about Jesus the Nazarene. So I don't know anybody who seriously doubts that.
I know some people who say that Jesus was just a good man. He was not the Son of God. I mean, or he wasn't, he was special in that he was an exceptionally good man.
So I want to tell you a couple of ways I think you could answer that. The first is that the phrase Son of God doesn't mean it's not a literal phrase in the Bible. When you read the Psalms, the king is called the Son of God. And the kings weren't God incarnate. There's no theology around that. I mean, so Son of God actually means like favored by God in the Bible. Jesus doesn't usually use that phrase. He calls himself the Son of Man. I don't know if you've noticed that. Some people say, oh, Son of Man really means Son of God, and Son of God really means blessed. I don't know. I think Jesus saying, hey, I'm the son of human beings is like this idea, like I'm in the human family, so are you. I'll tell you something kind of wackadoo I've talked with somebody on the screen about. If God is everywhere all the time, if God's omnipresent, can God be more present in one place than another? You have to decide. But to me, if you're omnipresent, you must be equally distributed as in a field, right? So here's a tough one. Was God more present in Jesus than God is in you?
Oh,
Or is Jesus more uniquely aware of God's presence? And our invitation is to become increasingly aware. Is Jesus more a child of God than you?
And for me, holy space is just our awareness, our heightened awareness of holiness in that space. To me, this is the same line of thinking.
And I don't know. Not everybody likes to think this way, and by all means, I don't mean to like disturb you, but you know, there is that like quote from William Blake: to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. And you know, I don't think William Blake was any kind of bishop, but I do wonder about that mystical contemplation. If we can't find God in a bog, it isn't the bog's fault. I do think we have a hard time recognizing God's equally dispersed presence wherever we go. I mean, there's just places that make it easier, you know, like Iceland, and not the smelly parts. That's a challenge, but glaciers and waterfalls, they just make it easy for me, you know. But maybe part of the spiritual journey is to find God's presence in City Hall or at a rally of the politician that you least appreciate. Is God present in a hurricane? Well, either God's omnipresent or God isn't. Actually, the scriptures, Psalm 27 talks about a hurricane, it being God's voice, and it makes the cedars of Lebanon skip like a calf. Anyway, hurricanes are really inconvenient for us coastal livers, but they've kind of always been around. We just chose to live here. You know, it's not like God punishes us. Like, there were hurricanes before there were people. Again, it's really inconvenient for me, but it is a way in which the world kind of regulates itself. We call it evil because it's inconvenient, but it's just a weather system. John?
I believe it's Nova has recently had a series about basically the universe and talked about really just how big it is. And when you talk about omnipresent and whether God is more omnipresent here or there, I think that if it were put to a vote, my vote would be that God is omnipresent everywhere. Also, another thought that I've had, I absolutely am a firm believer in global climate change. But the fact of the matter is, no matter what we do to the planet, it's still going to be here.
You know, it's interesting that the book of Exodus says that. It says you can either take care of the land or it'll cast you out.
Mike, we can destroy ourselves. And perhaps that will be the case at some point.
I
But
mean,
at the end of the
yeah.
day, this planet is still going to be here for some billions of years.
That seems to be the case, right? And I think even if you're not a global climate change person, you get, right? If you keep throwing nuclear radiation into the ocean, you're not going to be any fish left, right? I mean, like, and we do that stuff. Or if you've got a garbage island, it's difficult for the world to heal that when the single-use plastics are meant to last like 5,000 years. Like that's kind of significant. So I think whether climate change has been politicized, but let's just step back from it, right? Like my wife deals with this chemical called PFAS. I don't know if you know what PFAS is, but once you get it in your body, and by the way, it's all over your body, you can't get it out. There is no means for getting PFAS out of your body. What's it going to do to you? Well, nobody knows, but it's carcinogenic at the least, right?
Well, please don't misunderstand me. I think that we should do everything we can to control climate change, but that's so that we survive. But at the end of the day, even the plastic that has a half-life of 5,000 years, it's a blip in the map.
Yeah, but this all just concerns us, but it also concerns stewardship, right? I mean, if the earth is the Lord's and all that dwells within, and we're called to shepherd it, like we're not doing the best job, right? I mean, we're just not. Some people say like, well, it doesn't matter, it's ours to rule, but that's not how the scriptures read. It's ours to shepherd and steward, right? And look, I've been to a coal mine. There isn't anything great about working in a coal mine. I mean, it amounts to like slavery. If you've been down in a coal mine, it's dreadful. Now I know people choose to do that, but anyway, to me, environmentalism is like pretty important. Like it's part of our faith to like take care of the earth when we can, and not just when it's convenient. It just seems important.
Well, how come evangelicals don't see it that way?
Oh, because the sooner we wreck this world, the sooner we'll get the next one.
Oh shit! Sorry.
I'm not joking.
But it sounds weird though.
Well, we just want to speed up getting out of this world. Evangelicals have decided by and large that the world is a miserable place and you want to try to escape it. And I want to suggest if you believe that, that's probably will be true for you. And that's why I think coming back to this mystical idea that God is in fact present in the world. And if we can't see it, it's just our eyes that are our eyes, we need new lenses. That's compelling to me. Most people can accept that a little bit, but you really start pushing it. And Luke's going to push you on this. Luke, more than the other gospels, is going to push you. Who is God not in? Well, that's easy to answer. Hitler, Osama bin Laden. Luke says, yeah, God's in those people too.
How is he going to say that?
Oh, you'll see. The Good Samaritan is the easiest story. And you're going to hear Jesus say this incredible thing, right? In Luke, Jesus gets crucified and he says, God forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. It's a generous assumption when somebody does something that takes our life away, to say they're doing the best they can with what they've got and they could use more. Maybe it's helpful to tell you a couple fun factoids. Is that helpful? We went to Bethlehem on our pilgrimage in 2017, and the lady in Bethlehem who was our guide said, look, here's a cave, like a grotto, and Jesus was probably born in a cave. Historically, that could be true, but Luke isn't interested in that story. Luke says there was no room, so there was no room in the inn, right? No room in the inn, so he was like born in the barn. But actually, linguistically, what Luke says is there was no room in the extra room. Most houses were one level, and if people had enough means, they had another one on top. That would have been the guest room. The guest room was already full because Joseph's family was there for the census. So Jesus was born with the animals, which would have been on the first floor. The animals came in the house. And he was laid in a manger, which is a food trough. And it's helpful to remember that the way you did this is animals were brought in because they were valuable and they heated the home, and that there was sort of a step. The animals were on the bottom tier, and the step was maybe 2 feet tall. And there it was that the animals ate out of a food trough, and the people occupied the rest of that kind of raised platform so that the animals didn't overrun the people. So Jesus was just born in the house, says Luke, and laid in the food trough, which is where the animals would have been. But don't think he was born in a barn. Although that is helpful, the way we use that phrase, were you born in a barn? Well, yes, and so was our Lord. It's sort of this great way of saying, like, rather than that making me uncouth, that's where our Lord came from, in the low places. But instead of low places, really just here in the regular place. Jesus was born in a house like all other babies were. There weren't hospitals. I was born in Good Samaritan Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. Jesus was born there. It's not necessarily Luke is trying to single him out as exceptional. You're trying to point out he's exceptional because of how normal he was. Some folks conjecture Mary went to Bethlehem. Women were not meant to go on the census. Some people conjecture she went there because if she'd stayed back, she would have been burned alive because she had a child out of wedlock. Right? I mean, it's very likely Jesus grew up his whole life being taunted that he was a bastard. Lila asked me, what about the virgin birth? It's helpful to know that that word virgin birth, it really comes from Isaiah. There's a prophecy in Isaiah that says, behold, the virgin will give birth to this child, and before he knows his left from his right, the invading army will be gone. That was a time-specific thing, and Hebrew doesn't have a word for a woman who's never had sexual intercourse. It doesn't exist in Hebrew. Virgin is an age category, like maiden. Well, actually, maiden tends to mean virgin too. It just meant young lady. The young lady will. When the Hebrew Bible got translated into Greek, Greek does have a word for virgin that is like never had sexual intercourse. And the translators took the Isaiah phrase from young woman to the sexual category. They did that. So the Septuagint does something the Hebrew doesn't do. Why is it important to Luke? Most scholars would say it's because there were these stories that were circulating in the Greek world about Zeus and Hermes having sex with human people and creating demigods, right? And so I think the story is trying to say, look, God didn't have sex with a woman. It's meant to emphasize, right, that there's this incarnation of God is happening, but not in the Greek way in which gods rape women. Most scholars would tell you that. Another thing that's maybe happening is trying to resonate with that Isaiah passage. And remember, resonance doesn't have to be literal, it can be figurative. That's what Midrash does. It's a curious thing that the virgin birth became really important to Christian folk about 100 years ago. It wasn't actually all that important prior to that. It's one of the 5 tenets of fundamentalism, which was invented in 1916 by some oil magnate brothers who were not theologians. They just happened to be rich. and they embarked on a major pamphleteering campaign to include that the devil is real, like the diabolical red thing, that's a real thing, and the virgin birth is literally true. But that was a little bit artificial to most Christian practice. You might be thinking, well, the virgin birth is really important because of original sin. But remember, original sin didn't come around till 400 years after the story was written. It was Augustine's idea, and Augustine said original sin must be true because babies are selfish. We have a really different understanding about that. We understand that humans are born and that humans respond as mammals, as social creatures. We depend on one another as part of our evolution. When a baby cries, it's not because they're selfish, it's because they need something. And they can't meet that need themselves.
Mike, did you say that the virgin birth or the importance of the virgin birth is only 100 years old or so?
As a literally true fact, yes, it's a tentative fundamentalism.
What was the thought before that?
Diverse.
A what?
It was diverse. I mean, it depended who you were. Again, it could have been read figuratively or metaphorically or mystically. Could have been read as like, but you understand that like the modern obsession with like facts comes from the 1800s. People weren't worried about facts 200 years ago. When they wrote a biography, it wasn't supposed to like tell you facts. It was supposed to tell you about the person.
Well, if the virgin birth, the concept of virgin birth only coalesced to what it is today 100 years ago, where was the resurrection? Was it similarly not considered on the same level as virgin birth?
That's a great question. Some people continue to understand resurrection figuratively. Some people insist that it's a factual thing that looked like such and such. I don't know what to tell you on that. I mean, the most helpful approach is like, hey, we could choose to get bogged down in like whether it happened, but really the opportunity is to talk about what it means for us. That's not appealing to a lot of people. A lot of people need you to like have some kind of cognitive intellectual assent to a fact pattern. I just don't find it very life-giving anymore. I don't want to say it's wrong. It's just not life-giving for me to limit my faith to a fact pattern.
Well, it shouldn't it also be like it applies to us? It is a kind of reawakening for us.
Yeah, I mean, I hope we have resurrection moments in our own lives. Mm-hmm. Understanding, right, that I'm going to die again, like I'm physically going to die. And that like I haven't experienced some kind of like final resurrection, but I've got resurrection moments. And I don't think that's inappropriate to use that phrase. I have them in relationships with other people. I have them in relationships with like institutions. I have them in moments of my relationship with myself. Lila asked about the virgin birth being in the creeds. Yeah, I mean, it shows up in the Nicene Creed, and maybe it's helpful to know that that was Constantine's will to try to get some doctrinal unity because that benefited the empire he was running. Constantine was an emperor, right? He wanted people to be uniform, not unified, because that, helped him out. You should also know that the Nicene Creed didn't show up in like the liturgy until Charlemagne invaded the Goths, and they were all heretics, and he made them say the Nicene Creed in order to have communion. Well, that didn't happen until 800. So like the creed was a thing, but people didn't say it or recite it in church until 500 years after it was written. I don't know if that's helpful. You all know that the whole idea of the virgin birth got tacked on to the idea of the Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception describes Anna, Mary's mother, and says that Mary was also like not born from a human sperm and egg, just from an egg. And then like that way Mary could be born without original sin, because that's in men's sperm is where that is. But the Immaculate Conception wasn't made a Catholic teaching till the late 18th century. That's the 1700s. It's also weird. Sorry, like I understand what it's explaining, but it's just strange, you know? And I think there's this other bit about the virgin birth that we perceive to our detriment, which is like, Jesus is so special, we're not like him. Well, then what's the point? To me, the whole point of the incarnation is like God wasn't afraid to be a human being. Like there's something fundamentally good about being a human. And like living into the goodness of our humanity is like our invitation. There's this really cool thing that happens in the prayer book every night. If you do the Compline, we quote Simeon and we say, we say like, I've seen the Lord today. And it's interesting because like, that's not literally true, but it should absolutely be true that we've seen the Lord today in somebody, in ourselves, in somebody else, right? I mean, the prayer book invites us to like actualize what Simeon said, not at the factual level, as if that was the most important, right? But like so that our faith can resonate. All generations will count me blessed, for the mighty one has done great things for me. That's supposed to be how we end the day. It's a pretty cool invitation, the Song of Simeon.
Mike, I really like what you said about resurrection and how it can happen anytime and any place, because it seems to me that when we get mired down in living out poor choices and then choose to take another path, repent, that's resurrection, just literally resurrection in this life today. And it's such a blessing whenever you can recognize that.
And I'm an even bigger believer that in the way the story reads, right? This is to me how the story is like better than I could have thought up, right? The wounds don't go away. And in some ways, the life comes out of the wounds, like the new life comes out of them. They don't take it from you, right? I mean, I think about people who have been married for 50 years and their spouse dies. If the pain goes away, so did all your love. Like, you don't want that. I mean, the easiest way for it not to hurt is for you to have amnesia. But that's not a resurrected life. Sometimes I think we're so selective with this language, like I don't know that counts as a resurrection moment, that we do ourselves a disservice, right? Like when you have a semi-reconciliation with an estranged family member, that's a resurrection moment. When you're able to come out of episodic depression, that's a resurrection moment. When you're able to like look at yourself in the mirror and say, wow, there's nothing I'd change, that's a resurrection moment. And all of this, I think, like I don't want to like over push like prayer, but the scriptures ask us to pray without ceasing. And there's this line we've used a couple times recently in church: all creation is bathed in God. And if we were aware of that, it would be impossible to sin. That's the compelling vision of prayer to me now. An awareness of God's presence, of the infinite in the finite, that every aspect is bathed in God. To me, that awareness is what prayer is meant to invite us into. And maybe there's different strategies, like we ask God for stuff or we're grateful. But again, we don't exactly know what language Jesus prayed when he went off, but I'm pretty sure prayer is about being aware that God is present. And if I'm aware that God's present, hopefully I'm that recognition, well, my behavior will reflect that. If I get God's presence right, if God is present with a naughty and nice list, watching everything I do and racking up the charges, that just doesn't seem like a very good prayer life. It's like really scary. I like, God, just give me a break. But if God is like present and curious, what's he going to do next? I can't wait to find out. Well, that's an invitation, isn't it?
Hey, Mike. So, just a thought. If I beat myself up every time I do something that I perceive as wrong, am I playing God?
You're probably playing a false God, because I'm not sure God beats you up when you make a bad decision. I had this great story that to me sounds like the way God wants to behave. I was really concerned about something I had insider knowledge about, so I called the bishop to give the bishop insider knowledge. This was like something I had struggled with in the local community. And I said, I just need you to know all this stuff, Bishop. When I got done, he was like, hey, thanks for telling me. What'd you learn about yourself? And I was like, I think you missed the point, Bishop. You were supposed to learn from my story so you could make an informed decision. He was like, yeah, that's cool and all, but what'd you learn about yourself? And it caught me off guard because that wasn't why I called. But maybe that's what prayer is meant to do. The mystic people, like the good people, they say, we didn't pray to change God. We pray to be changed by God. So I will tell you, I've gotten off the cycle of God, my neighbor is sick and they need a heart transplant. And God, you just need to make sure they get that heart transplant. I don't even talk to my spouse that way. We wouldn't be married anymore. So, I think when my prayer life is making demands of God and expecting God to change, it's going to be pretty frustrating. That may work out for you. It hasn't worked out well for me. Sometimes I say, well, it's because I didn't believe enough or whatever, but that's putting all the onus on me, and it's limiting prayer to changing God. But what we say every week in the Lord's Prayer is, God, change us. Let your will in heaven be done on earth instead of let my will be done in heaven and on earth. Let me ask you one last question, because I want to honor our time. Next week is Thanksgiving break. I could meet Monday, but I can't meet Wednesday. Should we just take the week off? I'm seeing yes. So let's come back to lesson 20 on December the 1st. And I'll send that out in an email, and I'll put it in the e-news as well. Okay, lesson 20 on December 1st. And we can back into prayer, because actually Luke's gospel has the word prayer more than any other gospel. So we'll see it over and over again. Thanks everybody for your time. Grateful for you.